Okay, we're looking at chapter 3 from the Fisher book. We're going to look at precedents from 1870 to 1935. We're focusing really in large part on immigration policy. One of the areas that the Constitution seems to make very clear is that presidents in dealing with foreign affairs have a great deal of authority. And that they can act in a way that they think is best for the nation. So the question then becomes, where are the lines drawn? Where do we say, okay, look, the provisions in the Constitution in Article 2 that allow the president to do certain things, where does that end? Is there any congressional involvement at all, whether it be the House or the Senate? What are the lines of demarcation here, and how far do they go? In other words, even if you say the president is clearly got a right to do X, the question is, how far can they take X, right? When can they act on their own, clearly without any congressional involvement, and when can't they? And so what we see over time is this debate, this argument goes on and on. The Supreme Court has made certain decisions, but has also gone ahead and changed precedent because of new circumstances. So the first thing to understand is that as the process evolves, there's no specific thing that's been resolved for all time. There are things that have been given the moment sort of embraced, but the moment changes. It's contextual. So when we look, for example, at immigration policy, which is something that is very germane because immigration policy deals with and leads to population and resources. Now, I want to say something about population and our concern about it. From a purely process point of view, how immigration has always been one of the hallmarks of America, right? People coming over, seeking freedom and the like. The problem is, how does that get orchestrated? How do we control it? Because we need to control the number of people in the United States, only because if you just allowed everyone, let's take an extreme, ridiculous case, if you allowed everyone to come to the United States, everyone in the world, it couldn't function, right? It's impossible. The resources that are necessary would not be there, and there'd be a collapse of the system. So then the question becomes, what is the rate, and from where do we accept procedurally, process-wise, immigrants? That's the question that has to be answered. Now, if you look back in the past, it was more based on what the country felt it needed. You needed certain types of workers that were, perhaps coming from some other nation that, could contribute to that particular area. The argument today is that there are certain agricultural needs that are not going to be met by Americans. And so having immigrants come in that are accustomed to that process, involved in that process, makes sense. But you have to weigh numbers coming in with resources available. And there's a whole host of questions that have to be answered, just in terms of, how you deal with these issues. And the issues themselves will change. They're not stagnant. So again, it's hard to place a number. You can't say this is the number of immigrants you let in. And does the president alone make immigration policy? Or constitutionally, that should rest in the hands of Congress. And as we've said before, even though Congress has certain authorities, Congress doesn't often use those authorities. They'll sort of step back, let the president do certain things, and then go ahead. And if it blows up, president's fault. If it goes well, Congress can take some credit for it. So understand, it's a very complex, immigration is a very complex, issue. I think people like to think of it in a simple way. Do we care about people that want to come here? The answer is yes. So let them come. But the problem is, again, numbers and resources. It's just that simple. You want to help people that come. That means giving them resources and helping them acclimate and the like. But those resources are always limited. And as the population grows, pure economics, the greater number of workers there are, the lower the wage rate's going to be, because more people want fewer and fewer jobs. In other words, there are fewer jobs available. So the supply of jobs can't keep up with the demand for jobs. And the only way to clear that market is to lower the, is going to be to lower the, the minimum wage. People say, it doesn't make any sense for me to work, given the amount of money I'm going to be paid to do that. There are other things I can do. And so that's what we're really facing at bare bones, because it's a complicated issue and we're not really going to go into it. It's not a class on immigration. It's a complicated issue, but has far-reaching consequences for decision makers and for those that are coming over from wherever they may be coming over. So the Supreme Court, in looking at these, now remember, we're in the 1870 to 1935 frame, right? So we're talking post-Civil War, right? And we're talking 1935. So looming out there is going to be, consideration is certainly World War I, World War II, and a host of other challenges that are going to affect immigration policy. Obviously, there are people that, for political purposes, are trying to escape a country that, that they're in danger if they stay. So the pattern was to defer the constitutional authority of Congress, right? So the court adopted a principle from international law that recognizes the sovereign right of nations to decide which aliens to enter and which to expel. Okay, so the Supreme Court looks at this and says, look, there are limits that can be applied, and it's up to the nation to decide who they're going to allow in and who they're not. So in 1837, the court holds, and this is the city of New York versus Milne, in that particular year, in 1837, the court held that the event of collision between the right of state to exercise its authority to regulate vessels from abroad, actual vessels, and the power of Congress under the Constitution to regulate foreign commerce, the law of the state must yield to the law of Congress. Okay, so we get a bleed over into Congress. You'll see during this era, Congress is really giving a lot of, they defer a lot to Congress. Constitutionally, is well grounded in that idea. So what we have here is we do have this sort of, collision, if you will, between this right of the state to exercise its authority to regulate, in this case, vessels, in this case, from abroad, right, and the right and power of Congress under the Constitution to regulate foreign commerce. So the decision in the Mill case is that basically the law of the state must yield to the law of Congress. Congress makes immigration policy. And also, one of its broad powers, Congress, is commerce. If you look at the commerce power of the Congress, it's one of the most powerful, I would say the most powerful power they have, because commerce is expansive. And oftentimes very difficult to sort of navigate through, or for a president to sort of engage in. So you'll see that when we get to the next century, that the courts pretty much beg off. It's during FDR's time and the court packing scheme. The courts back out of these economic issues, in part because they feel that their institution may be threatened if you run, headlong into presidential power or congressional power. So they sort of beg off of it. But nevertheless, this idea of commerce comes in over and over again. Don't lose sight of that. Immigration policy is really well, baked into this idea of commerce. So for a lot of people, they don't think in those terms. But that's really what you're looking at. Okay, so when you look at that case, there's not a single justice made the slightest mention of some kind of implied, inherent, or exclusive, those are the big ones, right, for the president, power of the president over external affairs, as would be advanced by the Supreme Court decision in Wright. Now, Wright's a very important case, which we'll get to. But here, in that particular case, you don't have the court looking at any presidential power, right? And the power of Congress over foreign commerce can control state policies. All right, so look, Congress has the authority over commerce. When we deal internationally and we deal with immigration, we're dealing with commerce. So the court likes to decide things and look at things in a very narrow sense. That being the case, the court doesn't address presidential power at this point. They're not looking at either those powers which are implied in the Constitution or inherent or exclusive to the president. The president's left out of it. The president is not considered. They don't feel the need to consider presidential power here. For the court at this point, what they decide is that, look, what we've got here is commerce, and that's clearly under the control of the Congress. So it's interesting, right? If you look at Article 2, it appears that the president has pretty much control over anything that occurs off the shore of the United States, or things that come in as a consequence of the shore, of passing into the country. What the Supreme Court earlier on is saying that's really a congressional issue. And as we've talked about before, one of the problems with that is this need to act quickly. Not every issue provides for deliberation. And so a deliberative body like Congress can act quickly. And there's often a lot of conflict in resolving policies. And so there's a period of uncertainty, going back and forth. There's investigation, right? They call people into hearings. They try and figure out exactly the lay of the land and try and come up with a policy that makes sense. That doesn't allow itself to be really the kind of deliberation that we can afford if something needs to be done. All right, so there's, over time, like in 1889, there's a unanimous court decision that upholds a congressional statute passed previous that prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the United States who had departed before passage of the legislation. Now, I'm not going to go into the case, but the Chinese exclusion case, but the thing here is that we see once again that the court yields to congressional authority. The whole idea of this chapter is to talk about how that's actually the case. What you're going to see is it changes, but that's actually the reality. And as you look at particulars like Spanish-American War, you get presidents that obviously, because now you've got war. War is a special situation with its own unique considerations. Again, wars don't usually lend themselves to deliberation. You need an organized approach, someone heading it, president, making decisions. But the Constitution is very clear on who gets to declare war. Now, this becomes very complicated over time. What presidents realize, and what Congress pushes back on in terms of the War Powers Act, saying, look, we've got the authority to declare war. President says, fine, I'm not asking you to declare war in all these situations, right? Actually, we've declared war relatively few times when you consider all the various skirmishes that the president or a president has sort of involved the country. And so the important thing here is war is a special situation requiring less deliberation and requiring the president to ask for a declaration of war. If the president does not ask for that declaration, can Congress go ahead and declare? So when is a president actually fighting a war that was not declared? If we decide to bomb a nation because they did something X, Y, or Z, usually it's protecting property, or American lives, one particular set of circumstances that might force the president to sort of do something. Also, public opinion comes into play here because, again, it's all contextual. You can play that up. You can, in terms of a president, getting the public will behind it. FDR had trouble getting Americans behind being involved in World War II, really to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So it's not such a clear delineation. So presidents don't really ask nowadays for a declaration of war. They sort of act. So if you act in a way, is it possible to have a nation that is fighting a war against you, however you want to define war, I mean, that's the problem here. But you're not declaring war. You're not fighting a war back. You can declare war on the United States, but it doesn't mean that the United States says, okay, we're involved in a war. The United States could do something that would typically indicate, right, that there is a war. But if the other side doesn't see it that way, or the other side doesn't have the resources to fight a war, you simply say it's not a war. And they give all kinds of names to it over time, police action, like in Korea, and so on. But all of these things are really trying to get our minds around what's a war and what's not. Congress has tried to exert its authority, but again, as I've said before, that's a risky bit of business for Congress, especially when it comes to conflict. If it doesn't go well and Congress leads the way, that's problematic for them. Now they can hide sort of behind each other, but they take a vote. So people know. So Congress wants authority. So going forward, the War Powers Resolution, saying, and we'll get to it, the president must do certain things, right, as soon as there's any sort of involvement. But presidents don't. And then Congress comes back and says, hey, you're supposed to check in with us and the like. Now, Congress always has the purse strings. So they can go ahead and they can say, we're not giving you any more money to fight this war. The problem with that is then you jeopardize American soldiers, on the front lines and so on and so forth. And no congressperson wants to see American military die because they refuse to give money. So even though that's a threat, it's a threat they won't exercise unless there's such public disagreement over the war, or I won't say an uprising, but it's clear, like Vietnam, that this was not a war and was never declared. It went on forever, but it went on for a long time and was never declared. So it looks like, it walks like, it talks like a war, but it's not necessarily a war. So presidents then, as always, are sort of contained in terms of their actions, those limits of action based on, again, context. You can't lose context. You can say it 1,000 times. If you move aside context, then it's very hard to get your mind around that. Okay, so now, and I brought this up before, the idea of in Curtis Wright, right? Not a single justice in that case made the slightest mention of some kind of implied inherent exclusive power of the president over extended affairs, right? Now, that changes with Curtis Wright. They start bringing the president into it. Now, the other question here is going to be about treaties. And there again, that's a complex issue because the president does it with and by the consent of the Senate, but what constitutes a treaty? And that, again, also is something we'll get into. So back to the Spanish-American War. We talk about Polk initiatives in Mexico. It's been an issue for a long time. And Lincoln's emergency actions during the opening months of the Civil War. You look at those two things, right? And what we find is that the power to initiate military operations in the 19th century remained with Congress. To initiate, right? That's going to change. Why? Because presidents recognize, especially I think Lincoln, Polk, but especially Lincoln, that constitutional principle, as explained in the Chinese exclusion case, right, of 1889. The decision to spill the nation's blood and treasure was left to Congress, not to the president. Remember, going back, to an earlier lecture, one of the concerns was that a president had a lot of power because a president could get us engaged in some sort of military action. That foreign policy, leaving it up to the president, gave the president a great deal of power that would allow the president to expand that power, really to serve their own ends. So what you have to think about here is presidential power versus congressional power, and whether or not, again, this issue of acting with expediency or deliberation comes into play. The court looks at the Constitution and sees, I can't say they see so much as a conflict, as they see that different contextual situations require different decisions by the court. So when you talk about that war, it only lasted for a few months. That's it. Okay, so it would seem like, okay, it's a it's not significant, but it is, right? It lasts a few months. August 12th, Spain accepts an armistice, right? Okay. Why? And what happened? This is an example of it. That particular conflict, which wasn't long-lived, right, extends itself to the Pacific, right? This is exactly what happens. And the United States ends up acquiring the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, right? So it could be that you could have gotten around this, the military action, probably through diplomacy. But diplomacy wasn't used, right? So there's in your book, Senator John Coit Spooner wrote to a friend, and this is telling, quote, possibly the president could have worked out the business without war, but the current was too strong, right? The demagogues too numerous, and the fall elections too near. I can't think of a more precise contextual comment than that, because it really touches on the three most important things that influence a president's action in terms of the president looking at the political landscape and making that decision. All right, the current was too strong. There was a desire, right? And when that desire for it runs high, it's very hard to then stop it. So if you can get the public or Congress on board, you begin to get, a movement towards a certain decision rather than perhaps away from it. I think here there could have been a diplomatic solution. But once the idea of a conflict arises and people begin to accept that as the manner in which we have to respond, as that builds, it gets very difficult to change it. So public opinion, public perception, and political leaders sort of get ahead of that process, and now a president or Congress has to say, are we willing to run contrary to that? So this idea of the current, that gets whipped up. That's not something that just happens. That's something that people begin to perceive as something that must be done. And then once that's perceived in that light, that this is the way you resolve the issue, then that's the way you resolve the issue. When you think about whether or not American lives or property are involved, okay, as compared with just some sort of perhaps long-term consideration about what this action will mean, when you compare those two things, you begin to make a movement in one direction or another. Typically, American lives and property is an easy one. Typically people are okay with that so long as the current rises, right? And so when you think about that pushing decision or the process, you have to remember that whenever you limit choices, whoever has the power to do that, to shape the options, those are the ones that go on the table. And then people, those in power and others don't consider other possible options. There's always a narrowing of options, always a narrowing of what policy or action should be taken. There are, any number of choices, but you get a narrowing of those by someone. And we talked about this with Kennedy before in another lecture. And then you have to choose from those. And then it's very hard to get people to go off those into some other solution. And war, unfortunately, once it's begun, it's very hard to pull back. And you get this sense that, if things are not going well, just a little, a few more resources, a change of strategy a bit will be enough to, push the, things in your favor. But that is a slippery slope, as we saw in Vietnam. The more you try, there are things you weren't taking into consideration, right? Which is interesting because, this is why history is so important. During the war for independence from England, you know, there was a comedian who said, you know, sometimes in history things look strange. And when you think about that war, it's almost like there was a coin toss, a coin toss, and the side that won that toss made up the rules. And it almost seemed like the Americans said, okay, to the Brits, you have to wear brightly colored uniforms, march in twos, right, playing music, okay, while we stand behind rocks and behind trees and shoot at you. So you're marching in red uniforms, which were designed so that soldiers wouldn't see so much blood, right? Blend so they wouldn't freak. Sorry, it made no sense to do that, right? Okay, fast forward, Vietnam, Cambodia. What the same tact is taken by we didn't play music and so on, but the same tact is taken by those people, right? Because they didn't have the means to fight in a traditional way. The Brits thought, well, this is a conflict, of course, in a civilized society. You stop for tea, and you take a moment, and then you get back to the battle. But this is not, it's guerrilla warfare. It's always that when the other side doesn't have the resources to fight you head on. And so when you think in those terms, you begin to understand how important that current is, because you have to satisfy the ends, okay? All right, so also the demagogues are too numerous. There has always been a group of elites who decide that, ideologically, X or Y must be done. There are those that look at any kind of conflict as one that is probably best resolved by some sort of altercation. And so once you get that on the table, once you get those that believe this is the way it is, and also somehow feel like their decisions are the ones that should form the policy, their point of view rather, should form the policy. They base that on often their perceptions of the world and the international environment. Now, these demagogues are not only in Congress, they also have the president's ear, aides and the like. And so oftentimes you find, even to this day, when it comes to war, there are those that are more prone to conflict, getting involved in conflict, thinking that the United States must use its might and force in order to resolve issues. There are those that say, no, we don't do that. During the Cold War, for example, what you had the Soviets and the Americans sort of having their own camps. These nations are sort of under our control, those nations are under yours, and the Soviets and the Americans would keep those relative teams in check, if you will. Iran-Iraq war, for example, you have Americans on one side, Soviets on the other side, and resources were given by American or the Soviets to their side, if you will, just enough to have a sort of a tie, an even outcome. Nobody wins because having anyone win in that war was going to be problematic. So by giving resources, Americans would step it up, Soviets would back it off. That it allowed them to sort of fight to a draw, if you will. Another example, also don't forget, is Cuba in terms of the shooting from behind rocks and trees. That again, there we were not able to succeed. You can't fight a war by rules that you would prefer. It's always the same. Those that don't have the resources fight very differently. And finally, fall elections. Talk about context. Presidents and Congress are going to consider the political fallout from these decisions, right? And so as they get closer and closer to the fall elections, it becomes more and more important for them to think, from their own point of view, to think in terms of what best serves their reelection efforts. And also, don't forget who's giving money to them for their campaigns. Okay, so it's interesting that you've got these three things converging. Can you imagine when you got demagoguery? A lot of it, you've got fall elections and you've got public will moving in one direction. It's a recipe for limited policy-making decision, and you often end up in a place you don't want to be. There are way too many decisions in foreign policy and domestic policy, certainly, we all experience that there's too much influence based on the desire to be reelected. The idea is that you want to be in power. People don't run for office unless they want to have some measure of power. They all say they're doing it for their constituents. I'm not saying they aren't in some measure, but also it's self-aggrandizement and power. And the two political parties collectively want power for their own party because that allows them to capture, one, two, or all three branches of government. So in terms of appointing people to the Supreme Court and that sort of thing. Although I have to tell you, justices typically are not as conservative as those conservative presidents that nominate them, and the Congress then appoints. So what's interesting here is that conservatives and liberals alike typically they still are conservative for the most part, or liberal, but it's never as extreme as presidents hope it will be. It's just the way in which they view, the justices view their job. All right, so I talked about life and property actions, or considerations, and we see that a lot, right? Presidents have invoked the right to use military force abroad to protect American lives and property abroad as justification for military intervention in foreign countries. Okay, why is that? First, where do we draw the line? How many American lives have to be involved? One? And what are those circumstances? So if one, life is involved, is that, again, enough to spill American blood for that one life? What about property? What is the value of that property? What must that be? And I don't mean dollars. I mean in terms of policy. In order for the president to say, yes, we should do this, right? Think about, Iraq. We went in because the oil supply was being jeopardized. That country, which was oil rich, the thing that we I shouldn't say liked, but the thing that made it so valuable was that we knew that technology was not there really for the Iraqis to go deep into these wells and extract a lot of oil. Their leadership, Saddam, very different. So they weren't worried about that in terms of keeping power. If they sold that oil to the Russians or the Chinese, that would give them more power. So we went in under a pretense, weapons of mass destruction and all of that. Well, if there were weapons of mass destruction, we would have known about it. Remember what I said about the Iran-Iraq war? Well, we gave this stuff to them, so we would know what was there for the most part, right? And we could monitor what they were buying out in the marketplace. Keep in mind that at that point, the United States had more armaments than the next 17 nations combined. And easily 10 or 12 of those were allies. So there was really no threat from all this. It was about the oil, not weapons of mass destruction. In fact, when we went in, the first order of business was to secure the wells. Those wells were put on fire because that's what the war was, the conflict was really about. Now, was that worth it? Well, look, energy has always been a major source of concern. A nation without energy is going to collapse. So if you look historically, whether it's, I've mentioned this before, whale oil, or it's, crude, it doesn't matter. You need to function. And so if you think in those terms, you understand the value of it. So that property was not really American, but we went after it because it had such an impact on the American economy and the like. Now, it's easy to say that that's wrong. We shouldn't have done that. Okay, you make that argument, but what happens if our resources aren't what they need to be to meet the demand? Tie that to immigration. What does that do to the immigration rate if the major resource, remember the resources, oil, because that's where the energy comes from, is not available in a large enough quantity to keep things going? So it's always been a major consideration. Now, I am not talking about other sources of energy, clean energy and the like. I'm just talking about, property and the United States making decisions about when to go in, even when the property is not clearly American. What's the value of it? Certainly energy, as much as people may, not want to seem like it's so practical, energy is important, so you go in. Now, could there have been other options? Sure. Would they have failed? Don't know. But that was the decision, and the current, was very strong, and the election was important, at least to those elites. So that being the case, there's a decision. All right. So keep in mind that when you look at various studies that attempted to identify life and property actions that were taken, they've really expanded independent presidential power. Why? The current is so high. Typically, life and property actions are more accepted by the American public than those about resources. Even though those resources are important, Americans are not typically automatically behind a use of force in order, to keep resources flowing. So typically you try and couch it, not in terms of resources, but in terms of other things. So it's interesting, as your book says, in 1928, Milton Offutt compiled a list of 76 instances between 1813 and 1927. Okay, that's a relatively long period of time. While a 1945 study by James Grafton Rogers collected 148 examples of U.S. military operations abroad. Right? Now, there are declared wars during, in the Rogers numbers, but think about that. Take the number of actual wars and look at all of these presidential decisions to get involved. You kind of see pretty clearly that it really comes down to these decisions made by presidents. So you see what's beginning to happen during this period. More and more presidents are avoiding quote-unquote war, but they're getting involved in more and more conflicts, which are usually, fairly well embraced. Again, currents. All right, so if you look at Roosevelt, Teddy, he believed he could unilaterally use military force to advance his own foreign policy interests. Now, I gave you a list of 4 presidents that we're going to look at, and the context here is really interesting because a civil war with Lincoln, he understood he needed to get Congress involved. When you look at Teddy Roosevelt, you get someone who has a very different take on presidential power. So he believed that he could advance his own policy interests, and that was perfectly acceptable. So this idea crops up a couple of times, and it's clear. So if you look at sort of an overall, sort of perspective here, America had to intervene to protect another country's sovereignty because it has some impact on the United States. Okay, Roosevelt's actions were flagrant. The United States later agreed to make amends. All right, in this Panama Canal. The Thomson-Uredia Treaty of 1922 gave Colombia special rights and a cash grant of $25 million, back then that was a lot of money, to compensate, in effect, for Roosevelt's intervention. Right? We go to the Dominican Republic. And again, presidents now move in their foreign policy to the idea, again, now they're skirting treaties, right, of presidential agreements, arguing that they have the right, as any other leader, to make agreements with other countries. They have they have the authority, these agreements, to a large extent, of treaties, but there's no senatorial involvement in that, right? Presidential agreements and executive orders are two tools that get used more and more. Executive orders, even Washington used those, but some presidents have used them more than others, and it's a way of skirting Congress's involvement. I mean, some executive orders are just perfunctory. They don't have any real impact in any major way, but there are those that are pretty serious, changing American policy just by a stroke of the pen. When you look at World War I, for example, Wilson, right, took steps to prepare the nation for war, get the current going, right? In an address delivered to Congress on December 7, 1950, he recommended an increase in the size of the Army, here we go, acceleration of shipbuilding, and strengthening the merchant marine, right? Okay, we can see the direction it's going. And nevertheless, during his re-election campaign in 1916, he relied heavily on a promise to keep America out of war. Candidates are not, presidents or senators or representatives. They're candidates. And they will tell the public what they think the public wants to hear. And then, of course, once in office, there's a change, a move in direction. If you look at Franklin, FDR and Lyndon Johnson, two of the other presidents, we're going to look at Teddy Roosevelt and Lincoln as well. They both involved campaigns for re-elections. They were both involved in campaign re-election. Remember, the fall, right, is important. Elections are important. They also made similar promises that they were going to keep the United States of World War II or Southeast Asia in the case of LBJ. All right, I want to read you something from page 58. So we're stepping from, as the book says, we're stepping from neutrality to armed neutrality. And here's we're talking about the date Wilson. We're talking about Wilson at this point. We're talking about World War I. Here it is. Quote, I feel that I ought to obtain from you full and immediate assurance of the authority which I need at any moment to exercise, right? No doubt I already possess that authority without special warrant of law. Congress doesn't have to give it to me. I've got it. By the plain implication of my constitutional duties and powers. But I prefer, right, in the present circumstances, not to act upon general implication. I wish to feel that the authority and the power of Congress are behind me and whatever may become necessary for me to do, right? So the House passes a bill by 403 to 13, right? There was some filibustering in the Senate. But on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson called Congress into extraordinary session to review the continued use of German submarines against neutral vessels. That was one of the problems. Concluding that armed neutrality now appears to be impractical, right? He asked Congress to declare war on Germany. A step it took 4 days later. The Senate voting 82 to 6, and the House 373 to 50. Think about that now. They jumped on board. But here again, it's a pretty clear indication that there's a threat to American property and life overseas. And so what do? Also, you see an expansive power that's expanding into Europe or throughout Europe, and that obviously creates a problem for the United States. So it's important to keep in mind that these ideas of, in terms of decisions that are made by Congress and the president, there's a dance being done between them, right? How the decision gets made. Do you need Congress or don't you need Congress? And the arguments are varied, but nevertheless, the outcome is important, especially in a system where there's an election process, right? Going back to Marbury versus Madison, right? Chief Justice Marshall recognized that the heads of the executive departments function as political agents of the president and are subject to removal. Where are we going here with this? That the president has his own, obviously, branch, right? And there are executive departments. The question is, does the president have sole power over those departments? And you'll see what the court decides is that, well, there is congressional authority given to some of these departments, and therefore there is congressional control over some of, the president's executive branch, in one way or another, right? And that basically those differences between the president's control and Congress's control begin to really take shape, right? Something that said, this is on page 63, quote, the fundamental necessity of maintaining each of the three general departments of government entirely free from the control or coercive influence, direct or indirect, of either of the others, has often been stressed and is hardly open to serious question. There needs to be a separation. We accept that. Nothing in the framers' intent or operation of government over the years provides any support for total separation. They never intended it to be exactly, completely independent, and they never expected, although they make decisions in those branches, that there would not be any interplay, influence, or power in one area over other. Think about Marbury versus Madison. Think about presidential departments. Think about the Supreme Court. They make decisions that constrain congressional policy. That means that there's an influence. There's a bridge between the two. Congress doesn't just make policy and that's the end of it. Congress has that policy. If someone challenges it, that policy could be reviewed by the Supreme Court, and they can make a decision that it doesn't pass constitutional muster. All right. This is the idea over time during this period where the unitary executive idea is denied. You don't have blanket authority over all of your branch. There is a checking, right? There's separation branches, but there's also checking. Each branch is checking the other. That's the whole idea, right? That no branch acts independently, but has a level of independency to do its job. All right, we'll pick up this next time and move along Fisher's chapter 4.